Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 43rd episode of the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, a podcast all about the subject of antinatalism created by anti-natalists. My name is Amanda Oldphan Sukenick, also known as Foreverwolf Films on YouTube.
And I'm Mark J. Maharaj, also known as Question Mark on YouTube.
And today, we're speaking with Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Liberal Arts at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, SAIC, and author of many works, including his book, Philosophy of Love, Sex, and Marriage, An Introduction, Raja Halwani.
Welcome to the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, Raja.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's start out with just the most basic question. Who is Raja Halwani?
Raja Halwani is a Lebanese American philosopher, I guess would be the best way to describe myself. I was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and I lived half my life over there. That's where I went to undergraduate school. And then I came to the United States to get my PhD in philosophy in 1997. And I stayed in the United States since then. And I built my life here. I, of course, go to Lebanon every year, although for COVID reasons, I haven't been able to go for the last year and a half or so. So I maintain my ties to my original home country, or to my other home country, that is to say. And my main interests in philosophy are mostly in philosophy of sex and love, which I have published a lot. I also am very much interested in philosophy of art, in virtue ethics and moral theory in general, specifically virtue ethics. Of course, political philosophy, especially questions concerning terrorism, nationalism, and border and territorial disputes. And this stems from my interest in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I know a lot about that conflict. I have published on it. And recently, I have been more and more interested in reading up on misanthropy in philosophy. Of course, I've always been interested in questions about anti-natalism. I know David Benatar's work. I know quite a few of other work, like Shauna Shiffrins, for example, in philosophy, but I haven't really published in that area. I've taught it a little bit, but I haven't really published in it. So that's who I am, basically. I don't know. I hope that didn't go on too long. So,
you're interested in virtue ethics. Are you a virtue ethicist?
That's a difficult question, Mark, to answer, because depending what you mean by virtue ethicist, the answer could be yes or no. I am not a virtue ethicist in the sense that I'm not sure that virtue ethics is the moral theory that is the correct one, because as you know, philosophers often have their own favorite moral theories that they are the true moral theories. So you have the utilitarians, you have the Kantians, you have the virtue ethicists. I'm not sure I'm a virtue ethicist in the sense that I think virtue ethics is the moral theory to answer all questions, especially if you think that virtue ethics grounds all the important moral values. I don't think it does that, but I am a virtue ethicist in the sense that I do think that working on the notion of virtue and what the virtues are and cultivating the virtues in people is actually a very important moral task that has been neglected for many decades by moral philosophers. As a matter of fact, for a long time, since the ancients, Kant is often dumped on as being a philosopher who didn't care about the virtue, which is an absolute error because Kant devoted a lot of space in his writings to the virtues. So in that sense, I'm a virtue ethicist, yes.
Okay, and why philosophy? Like, why'd you pick this as a profession? And
that's a nice question. I guess ultimately it just appealed to me. I remember when I was an undergraduate in Beirut, I attended the American University of Beirut, and I was majoring in economics at the time, which I didn't really like. I didn't hate it, but But the nice thing about the American University of Beirut is that they have a large number of credits that you have to take as electives, and so I just basically took electives in archaeology, in history, in literature. And then we had to take those 4 courses called civilization sequence courses that start with the Epic of Gilgamesh, and they go all the way into back then, what was the 20th century. And I remember falling in love with reading Aristotle and Kant, and that's when I decided. And then I took a course in Islamic philosophy with my professor, Majid Fakhri, and I just loved it. And I decided to go into philosophy. I was going to do a PhD in economics. And so then I made the argument with myself that, well, if you're going to go for a PhD and end up teaching, why do a PhD in a field that you don't really like, such as economics, whereas you can do it in philosophy? I mean, I'm going to end up having the same job, the same kind of income, which is getting money from teaching. So I ended up going for philosophy, and I haven't regretted it. I think it's one of the most interesting fields, and it's also, I find it the most intellectually challenging field, which I really like. I think fields like not to dump on them, not to, of course, history is but I think intellectually speaking, fields like history, literature are not as difficult mentally, intellectually speaking, as philosophy, and I enjoy that. It's very frustrating sometimes, but I enjoy it tremendously also.
That I feel you on that. It's frustrating, but I enjoy it as well.
Yeah.
And how come the philosophy of sex? Because the few philosophers that I've spoken to, they all have your book. Because they're like, when it comes to philosophy of sex, that seems to be like a comprehensive volume. And I'm just curious, like, how'd you get involved, like, in that particular area?
Yeah, the answer to that question is mostly, personal, in the sense that it is not about the importance of the field itself. Although I think a case can be made that philosophy of sex is one of the most important, should be one of the most important fields in philosophy, because sex, of course, is the way that the human species reproduces, basically, itself. Sexual pleasure is one of the most unique and intense pleasures that people experience. People do a lot of crazy, stupid stuff just to get sexual pleasure. I mean, just Bill Clinton in the White House is one paradigm example that comes to mind. I mean, there could be gendered issues here between men and women in terms of what they're willing to do to obtain sexual pleasure. And I think that's a question interesting in and of itself. So it is an important field. But to me, it came out of my interest in virtue ethics, because when I started reading Aristotle, and I started reading especially about the virtue of temperance, which I know the word temperance is like an archaic word, but usually the virtue of temperance is just the virtue that basically moderates our desires for food, drink, and sex, basically, right? And so I was really interested in the question of temperance, but I was also at the same time reading a lot of philosophers who tend to be very conservative about sex. So basically, who think that casual sex and promiscuity are somehow morally bad. And of course, I'm a gay man, and not just, not to perpetuate stereotypes about gay men, but gay men tend to have a lot of casual sex, basically. I mean, the dynamics of sex between men are very different as to the dynamics between sex and in the sex between men and women. And so, gay men, are able to have sex with other men a lot, basically. And so, to me, that crystallized the question: well, what would an Aristotelian such as myself have to say about temperance, about moderating one's desires for sex, and the question of casual sex and promiscuity? Because when people think about sexual moderation, they tend to think of it as in terms of amount. So don't eat too much, don't eat too little. So eating too much would be a glutton, eating too little would be just a form of insensitivity, as Aristotle calls it. So the first question that came to mind is, what would it mean to have too much sex and too little sex? So what does So then I started thinking of the virtue of temperance in a very different direction, that it's not about amounts, but it's about something else. And so my interest in philosophy of sex came out of my interest in virtue ethics, specifically the virtue of temperance, and my being a gay man and thinking about certain sexual practices that gay men engaged in.
Wow, yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Raja. It was a really fascinating look into your motivations and everything. As we discussed a little bit before we began, antinatalism is not really your subject, but I do think you have such a unique perspective. Before we go on, I just wanted to give our audience a little bit of context as to, how I know you. So you are, of course, a professor at my beloved alma mater, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And in 2015, I was in my last semester of graduate school at SAIC, earning an MFA in print media. Now, during this time in graduate school, antinatalism was the subject and inspiration for just about everything I did. And the vast majority of both the student body and faculty, while being very welcoming of my obsession with antinatalism, had never really heard of this idea, had no idea what to do with it, or me. And then almost miraculously, our mutual friend, the great animator and filmmaker, Jim Trainer, happened to mention to me one day, "Oh yeah, do you know Raja Halwani? I think he's talking about that thing you like." And it turned out to be true. Antinatalism was in fact one of the subjects that you were covering in what I'm fairly certain was your undergraduate class, Controversial Moral Issues, in which you were using the book Life, Death, and Meaning, Key Philosophical Readings on the Big Questions, a book edited by David Benatar himself. And you were using it as a kind of textbook. Now, being a desperately busy graduate student in the middle of making my anti-natalist movie, The Ethicist, I was unable to actually make it to all of the full course, unfortunately, and I have a lot of regrets about that. But you were extremely kind in allowing me to audit some of the class, and I feel like I really got to witness something very special by doing so, because I think even still, it's quite rare for these subjects like antinatalism, like extinction, like the right to die, euthanasia, to be presented to undergraduates, and the reactions to the subjects were quite memorable. And I just think you did a wonderful job of presenting those ideas to very young minds. So for part of our time together today, I want to talk all about the general subject of teaching antinatalism, as well as discussing with you both antinatalism in the context of your specialty, which is the philosophy of sex, as you said. But first, I'd just like to ask you some more basics about yourself. May I ask, how long have you been teaching at SAIC?
I've been teaching at SAIC since 1997 when I got hired.
Oh, wow.
It's been more than 20 years. Yeah.
Wow, incredible. Do you consider yourself an artist of any medium yourself?
No, I don't.
Okay. How did you come to have an interest specifically in the philosophy of art?
My dissertation was in the philosophy of art, actually. When I graduated from Syracuse University, I did my PhD in philosophy of art. It was specifically in philosophy of literature and the question of the connections between intentions and interpretation. There is a large debate in philosophy of art about, on the one hand, you have this question of art is infinitely interpretable or indefinitely interpretable, and this is why we value art. One of the reasons why we value art is because works of art yield various interpretations of it, or can yield various interpretations. But on the other hand, there's the question of art being a product of it's an intentional object. It's the product of a person made with a specific purpose, and so on and so forth. So there's always a debate in philosophy of art about the relationship between interpretations, whether any are correct or true, and where the artist's intention comes in that. And I was specifically interested in that as far as literature is concerned, because obviously literature is done in words, and so words often have more or less specific meanings and so forth. So that's where my interest came. It was in philosophy of art. But then slowly after that, I drifted more and more into moral theory, into ethics. The last chapter of my dissertation was actually something about virtue ethics and literature, although I don't remember what I wrote in that chapter. So, but since then I drifted, but I maintained a constant interest in philosophy of art, especially since I teach at an art school. So I constantly read up on what's going on in philosophy of art. I've published a couple of things in philosophy of art, especially on the areas between art and ethics, which is called often moderate moralism or ethicism, basically. So yeah, this is how I got my interest in philosophy of art. Yeah.
Why are you, or why are you not, an anti-natalist?
I think I'm an anti-natalist. I am. I don't think I am. I am an anti-natalist. I remember since I was a kid, I remember, whenever my mom or somebody would tell me, "Oh, guess so and so I just found that so and so is pregnant, and I'm so happy for them." I remember my reaction was one of sadness, and I couldn't quite figure that out, basically. I never understood why I would feel sad about this. And then as I grew older, and as I slowly started realizing that, life has a lot of good things in it, human life specifically, and we can talk about animals and other lives too, of course. I realized that human life has a lot of interesting things to it, a lot of good things to it. And human beings are able to enjoy life in various different ways. But I also came to realize just the tremendous amount of suffering that people undergo. And because of personal circumstances that I'm not going to go into, but the suffering in question to me was not just physical suffering, but was also mental suffering, mental anguish, which I witnessed all around me, especially for someone who grows up in Beirut, when there was when there was a long civil war, basically, the effects of which we are still feeling, and the intersection between the civil war and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because Lebanon played a major role in that conflict, or at least was made to play a major role in that conflict. So there were a lot of horrible things going on. It wakes you up. It wakes you up. It makes you realize that maybe life is not all that it's jacked up to be, basically, right? But at that time, and even later into the years, it was mostly a gut feeling that I had. I hadn't articulated it in any way. I hadn't defended my position in any way, and so forth. Until I read David Benatar, really. I mean, David Benatar and I we're not friends, but we know each other quite well. We communicate quite regularly, more or less. He has an essay in the philosophy of sex, the sex book. But I did read his stuff on Better Never to Have Been, his book, Better Never to Have Been. And I have to say, I find his argument quite convincing about the asymmetry between pain and pleasure, and the asymmetry between whether we think the presence is pain is bad, but the absence of good is not bad, basically. And so I was convinced by David Benatar. And I know that there are a lot of philosophers who have been pushing against Benatar's view. I don't know everything that has been published since the book came out, especially by way of criticisms of his views. I've read some and I didn't find them convincing. I've read some of Benatar's replies to those things. I found his replies convincing. So basically my main reason actually for my main way for justifying my anti-natalist position has been Benatar's argument, the asymmetry argument.
What did you think of Shauna Shiffrins' argument?
Shauna Shiffrins' argument is good. I'm trying to remember exactly how her argument is, but I think her argument is a lot more constricted in scope than David Benatar's argument, basically, because her argument has to do with, if I remember it correctly, it has to do with harms that can come to specific lives, basically, and the chances that those lives might be good or bad. Whereas David Benatar's argument, I think, is wider in scope, and I'm more inclined towards Benatar's argument than Shiffrin's argument.
Okay, thanks.
I would have to agree. I think. How do you define antinatalism?
So to me, the definition of anti-natalism, basically, it is anti-natalism at its core is a moral position, basically. It is a normative position. It's not a descriptive position. It's not, obviously not, it doesn't describe the practices that people engage in when they do not have children, right? So to me, first and foremost, anti-natalism is a moral position, and it's a moral position that basically advocates for the cessation of procreation, of continuing to have children. But the reasons why someone is an anti-natalist, of course, can vary a lot. The moral reason one offers as to why one is an anti-natalist can vary a lot. But at its core, this is anti-natalism. It's basically a moral position that advocates for the cessation of procreation, with the understanding that if this happens consistently, at some point human life will come to extinction, basically, correct? But I don't think a definition of anti-natalism is necessarily hostage to a specific set of reasons as to why we should be anti-natalist. So I would confine the definition to the position itself, as opposed to why somebody might come to that position.
Yes, excellent. No, thank you for that. Yeah, it's I'm always fascinated by hearing how people will answer that question, because at this time, antinatalism is still not an official word in any dictionary in the world. Maybe somewhere in Korea, I've been told, and Germany, but haven't been able to actually find evidence. Right. So it's still a bit up in the air, and you're quite right. What draws people to this philosophy is incredibly diverse. And there's incredible amounts of disagreements between what antinatalism is, even amongst antinatalists, pardon me. Yeah, so thank you for that.
As a matter of fact, sorry, Amanda, as a matter of fact, when I'm writing an email and I type anti-natalism, it automatically autocorrects it to anti-fatalism.
Yes.
Correction. So it's not even in the, anyway, yeah, sorry, go on.
Or anti-nationalism is another one that I see all the time. Yeah, it doesn't quite know what to do with it yet. In addition to being a philosophical position, antinatalism over the last 10 years or so has also become a social movement as well. What is your general exposure to this side of antinatalism, and what is your opinion of this side of antinatalism?
I haven't, to be honest, I haven't been exposed to the side of antinatalism as a social movement. I don't know of many people. I don't know many people in my circle of acquaintance and circles who are anti-natalists. The people with whom I speak about it tend to often be basically shocked that this is a position that is espoused. So I'm not, to be honest with you, I'm not that in contact with the social movement. So I don't know much about that. I don't know how prevalent it is either. Basically, my hunch is that it's not that prevalent, but I might be mistaken about this.
I was just curious, what's the reaction with your colleagues with this particular topic?
My colleagues, my philosophy colleagues, their reaction is perfectly fine because philosophers are often used to dealing with controversial issues. It's not a stranger to them, and in addition, they're very much aware that we do have robust discussions in philosophy about anti-natalism. Benatar's works and others obviously he's quite famous, so their reaction is not. Is perfectly normal. They're like, oh yeah, okay, that's interesting. My colleagues at SAIC, their reaction, I have a very good friend of mine. She's actually one of my best friends at SAIC. She's very sympathetic to the position. As a matter of fact, whenever we talk about it, we're both always amazed at this drive that people have all the time to want to have children and so on and so forth. So but the others are also, at least with those with whom I've spoken about this, they're quite, their reaction, that's interesting, that's interesting. So there is no immediate rejection or blah blah. The tricky thing about discussing anti-natalism with my colleagues is that many of them have children, right? So it's hard for them. So it's a tightrope to walk, because you want to discuss it with them in such a way that you don't come as accusatory or as basically saying you have done the wrong thing by having children, right? And this is tricky, especially in those cases when colleagues or family members or friends have children who are suffering from various ailments, basically, who are not having an easy life, let's put it this way, right? Who have had to struggle with a disease or with an ailment that is, what's the word that I'm looking for? That has no cure, basically, that they have to live with, and that causes them a lot of suffering, that causes their families a lot of suffering, and so forth. Whether we're talking about something physical or something mental, basically, right? So not only is it tricky to talk to colleagues who have children about it, but it's especially tricky to talk to colleagues who have children who are suffering from one issue or another, because their sense of either being judged or their sense that their sense like, shit, did we do something bad here by bringing a child into existence, is often palpable, And I don't want to talk to people about anti-natalism to make them feel bad about themselves, especially about doing something that there's nothing to be done about at this point, basically, other than to. So yeah, so to answer your question, Mark, the reactions tend to be perfectly neutral, perfectly fine. SAIC in general, and maybe we'll talk about the students later, but SAIC in general is a very welcoming place to all sorts of intellectual ideas. This is one of the best things about SAIC that I like. So it has been good. I can't complain as far as the reactions are concerned.
Good to hear, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to second that. My time in grad school, I also did half my undergraduate at SAIC. They're incredibly, my experience anyway, is that they're incredibly welcoming to controversial ideas. I only had one bad experience my entire, grad school during a critique. Like, I had one person that wouldn't stay in the room, was so offended. I did want to say, a great many antinatalists are parents, but it is a very tricky tightrope, to have that conversation with people that have procreated. So I do sympathize with that. Absolutely. How do you feel antinatalism intersects with other social and ethical issues, particularly such as atheism, veganism, and the right to die?
Let me write that: veganism and atheism and the right to die. Yeah, that's a nice question. I was thinking about it a little bit. I think the main intersection between anti-natalism, veganism, atheism, and the right to die has to do with the decentering. What I would like to say, the decentering of the supreme value of human life, or basically the decentering of the sanctity of human life. The decentering of human beings has happened since Darwin, probably since we have evolution, since the theory of evolution has informed us that we are not, that we are not the divine creations of a supreme God necessarily, but that we have evolved over long periods of time. Freud, of course, has decentered humanity by basically illustrating, to the extent that Freud was right, by illustrating that human beings are far from being ruled by their reason, They are actually ruled by irrational drives and subconscious drives, unconscious drives that often lead them to do all sorts of things. So there has been a lot of decentering of human beings in general. But one thing that hasn't been decentered necessarily is the idea that human life is sanctimonious. There's something very sacred about human life, right? But I think veganism, atheism, and the right to die, plus anti-natalism, de-emphasize this, because they all in their own way send the message that human life is not as sanctified as we think it is. The right to die movement basically says, basically says that if people wish to cease existing, their life isn't that special, not because of the individuals that they are, but simply in virtue of being human beings, that it's okay to allow them to end their existence, basically. Veganism tells us that animals' lives are as important as human lives, maybe not quite as important, but at least certainly way more important than we have thought to be. This is why, by the way, I and some others have issues with certain animal rights organizations that are often quick to euthanize animals, because often that sends the message that, I mean, we are not as quick to euthanize human beings as we are to euthanize animals, right? We tend to take human, so some people basically say, well, euthanizing animals so quickly really actually sends the message that maybe their lives aren't as important as human lives. But anyway, that's a whole different topic. And atheism, of course, decenters the sanctity of human life by sending the message that there is no God out there that thinks that we are special. Insofar as we set God aside, we are basically sending the message also that human life might be on the same footing as the life of a plant or as the life of an non-human animal from the point of view of the universe. I mean, if there is no God to look after us or to think that we are special or to judge us at the end of times or whatnot, then from the point of view of the universe, we are as valuable as a plant, as a rock, as an animal. So I think all these movements have at their intersection the idea that human life is not as sanctified as we thought it was, basically. Yeah.
That was an excellent answer. Thank you so much for that, Raja. And I think that's the perfect way to frame it too, the decentralization of what being a human means. I know that you may not have as much familiarity with some of these terms, but as you may know, antinatalism is sometimes split into four generalized categories with plenty of wiggle room in between. Anti-natalism, which is both its own category as well as being the umbrella term, ephilism, vehement, which is the voluntary human extinction movement, and child-free, the child-free lifestyle. Do you have any thoughts about any of these terms or each of these terms?
I mean, I have some thoughts. Yes, I don't think any of the thoughts that I have are going to be anything original or anything interesting. The one about the ephilism, the one thought I have about it is that I still struggle with it, because even though I know that life can be quite harmful in itself, basically, and all this, there are also a lot of good things about life once somebody is born. How one life goes. Sorry, this is going to use the word life a lot of times, but how one's life goes in life is a lot of time is very much contingent on one's circumstances and so on and so forth. So insofar as ephilism is a blanket condemnation of life as such, it worries me a little bit, because there are, once one is born, there are certain good things about life, and one can make life as good as possible for other people. I'm in favor of the voluntary extinction of human life. I mean, I know this. I know to many people this is going to sound crazy, and but to the majority of people this sounds crazy. But I think if we are committed anti-natalists and we stop having children, we stop bringing children into this world, basically, this is eventually a form of a voluntary extinction of the human race, basically, because each person or each couple are basically making the decision to not continue to perpetuate human existence on the planet. And I think this is an acceptable consequence or implication of anti-natalism, and so far as it applies to human beings, basically. So these are some of my thoughts on this. I mean, I really don't have much to add because, but yeah.
No, that's quite all right. Thank you for your thoughts on that. Maybe we'll get a little bit into more detail about some of the differences between these things in a bit.
Sure.
But one thing I actually forgot to write a question about, but I wanted to make sure to ask you about, because you had mentioned it in your email, is you've talked a little bit about having a particular interest in misanthropy in philosophy, and there is definitely a whole area of antinatalism and antinatalists that identify specifically as misanthropic antinatalists and misanthropic antinatalism. What are your thoughts on that? I'm really curious to know.
So that's nice. So misanthropy, if you look up misanthropy in the dictionary or in the Oxford English Dictionary or Webster's or something like that, the most common definition that you come up with misanthropy, that comes up for misanthropy, is that misanthropy is a form of hatred of humanity, basically, right? So there is this common understanding of misanthropy and misanthropes is that they are haters of humanity. They hate human beings. And I'm sure that's true of some people. I'm sure that's true of some misanthropes. But there are a number of philosophers today, like David Cooper and Ian James Kidd, for example, who argue, rightly to my mind, that misanthropy at its core is not so much necessarily an emotional feeling towards humanity, such as hatred, but it's mostly the judgment that humanity has been a failure of some sort on a massive scale, right, basically. And having that judgment about human beings that humanity is a failure on a massive scale is compatible with a range of attitudes towards human beings, right? So I think Kant had something. Kant discusses misanthropy a lot, by the way, but he himself is not a misanthrope, and he himself thinks that adopting a misanthropic attitude is not a good idea because it goes against some of his moral claims. But you can look at human beings basically, and you can have one or two attitudes towards them. And sometimes you can shuttle back and forth between them. One attitude is that you look at human beings and you look at all the evils that they do, and you think them abhorrent creatures, right? You're like, this is just awful, I remember one time walking down the street, and this woman was walking with her husband, and she kicked a pigeon. A pigeon was crossing in front, and she just kicked it in the air. And so I went up to her and said, "Why did you kick the pigeon?" It's just, notice, and this is just one stupid example among many, many others, right? So there is one way to look at human beings where you find them evil, basically, or evildoers, right? But there is another angle you can look at human beings in which you can actually find them to be objects of sympathy and pity to some extent. Because when you look inside, you realize how many of us toil under lots of mental anguish, anxiety, worries, and so on and so forth. And then you can look at human beings as being, they have some sort of free will, but they can also be, a lot of their actions stem from the kind of troubles that they often go through. So there is this, and this allows a misanthrope, or this allows somebody who accepts misanthropy to not necessarily, so this allows for a common ground for all misanthropes, which is to look at human beings and you say, well, we're a massive failure in so many ways, right? But at the same time, it can allow for a range of attitudes that a misanthrope can have. We don't have to hate human beings. We can look at them with some compassion. We can look at them with some sympathy. So I just wanted to get the idea out there that misanthropes are not necessarily people who hate humanity. They can approach it with a lot of compassion, right? And of course, I'll get to anti-natalism in a second, but of course, the main response to misanthropy is that, well, human beings do a lot of good in the world, right? There is a lot of compassion, they help each other, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. And usually my response to this is that probably 80% or 90% of the good that we do is in response to the evils that people do. In other words, if human beings didn't commit so much evil in this world, so much bad things, whether culpably or not is not the question, we wouldn't need to be as compassionate. We wouldn't need to be so generous. We wouldn't need to have the virtues, as a matter of fact, because most of the virtues, I know Mark was asking me earlier about virtue ethics, most of the virtues are not agent-oriented. Most of the virtues are about how you treat other people, right? And so on. And so, yeah, human beings have, I think as a species, we're probably the worst species on the planet. As a matter of fact, the philosopher David Cooper makes the argument in his book, Animals and Misanthropy. He compares human beings to non-human animals. And his argument is basically, whereas you can find a certain way, whereas you can describe animals as being virtuous in certain ways. Of course, they don't have the kind of virtue that human beings have, because virtue in human beings is fully conceptually loaded and all that. You do not find vices among animals. Even when 3 or 4 lions bring down a zebra to eat it, you don't look at them and say how cruel or how mean, because we understand that they do it out of necessity. But we do find vices among human beings. So this means that not only are human beings the worst species, but human beings are probably the only bad species, because other species can't really be described in terms of moral terms as being bad and good. But anyway, that's all different. So the conjunction that I find between antinatalism and misanthropy occurs precisely with that kind of misanthropy in which there is an attitude of compassion towards human beings, especially future generations, right? So the idea is that, look, if we have accepted the fact that human beings are a failure in general as a species, right? And a failure that has caused a lot of suffering for human beings and other creatures, then it's a form of compassion to basically encourage people to not have children, certainly to not have as many children as they would otherwise have. So whereas you can conceive of a position of somebody who's a misanthrope who hates humanity, who basically says, screw you, keep having children because I want to keep seeing you commit the same awful mistake over and over again just to see you suffer, you miserable little, something like that. You can imagine a position of a misanthropist like this. So that wouldn't be an antinatalist position. So the real conjunction is going to be between the compassionate misanthrope and the antinatalist. Yeah, sorry that went on too long, but I think there are interesting connections there.
No, not at all. Not at all. I'm so happy that you answered that question. So much of what you just said mirrors my own thoughts on misanthropy, because I'm always frustrated with, again, that accusation that critiquing humanity is somehow a hatred for humanity, and that's not. I just am so frustrated that that just basically trying to articulate the reality of what we are is bludgeoned with this loaded term. And so, yeah, I don't know how to fix that. But
I mean, the interesting thing about this is that this is a widespread conception among human beings, and that's probably another piece of evidence of our failure, which is that a lot of people sometimes think that you criticizing something is a form of disliking that thing. I mean, I remember that thing has happened with 9/11. Whenever people try to criticize their own country, people say, oh, you like it or leave it. If you criticize the US, that means you hate the US. And it's not just the United States, every nationalist country that a lot of people, like India, for example, Lebanon, critiquing your country is something that means that you hate it. And even in academic circles, sometimes, where you say, if you criticize a fellow colleague or if you criticize an argument that somebody made, the response is, well, you're being somehow sexist or racist or something like that. So there's this confusion between proper criticism that is well motivated, right, and thinking that the criticism is a form of dislike or enmity or hatred.
And you'll see this every day in art school, where people are so afraid to make critiques of people's work that a lot of critiques are silent. You have to wrestle with people to get words out of their face.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm not tracking right, but it is making a value judgment on humanity, is it not?
Yes. But the thing, Mark, is that, so there are two distinctions within misanthropy that's important to keep in mind. One distinction that I have mentioned earlier is a distinction between judging humanity in general as a failure versus what attitudes we should have towards that kind of
right
behind that judgment. Another important distinction is between judging humanity as a failure in general and judging individual human beings as failures. And I think I think you can be a misanthrope, and of course this takes us into questions in philosophy about collective responsibility and all this, which we might not want to get into, but a misanthrope is someone who basically says humanity at large has failed. A misanthrope isn't necessarily interested in pointing fingers at individual human beings, although of course we can, especially prominent individuals like Stalin, Hitler, Pol Pot, the usual examples come to mind, right? So we could point to individual human beings and say, you have failed miserably. And you don't have to have Stalin in mind to make that example. We can point at some of our friends and how they treat their pets, for example, or some of our colleagues and how they do, we can, but the main thing behind misanthropy is that it's a judgment about humanity at large, not necessarily about individual human beings. And so this means that somebody can be a misanthrope while at the same time liking, admiring, respecting a large number of individual human beings, basically. So maybe that addresses the question a little bit, Mark. I'm not sure.
It's just I have a little bit of hesitancy on the judgment. due to like I think that the difference between the species when you focus on the human is moral agency and the ability to make these ethical choices. However, I think the evolution of our morality, particularly with our instincts, does come from like other species. Some of them do have senses of fairness and being wronged, and they will retaliate. So I feel like there are rudimentary forms of agency within other species, and to just make a judgment on humanity seems I'm skeptical of it right now.
Yeah. So do you want to say, I don't mean to turn this into a question to you, but I just want to make sure I understand the question before I say a little bit more about it. So do you want to say that we are also in a position to judge certain other species of failures, basically?
I just don't know why the focus would be on humanity when we're all animals. So I feel like it's a speciesist argument to be misanthropic about the human species because we have this particular feature. When that particular feature is just maybe to a higher degree, but not necessarily only us. So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
You know, if I can just jump in briefly, I do want to second what Mark is saying, that I think, I mean, this is sort of goes back to the ethicist position, that the design is bad. Like the DNA is faulty from the very beginning, and whatever it produces is going to have these critiquable offenses. Let's just put it in those kinds of terms. Please go on, Raj. I'm so sorry.
No. There's no need to apologize. This is fantastic. I mean, so this is a difficult terrain. This is really difficult terrain. So I agree with you, Mark and Amanda, that we are all animals in some respect, right? But I think the crucial thing that you said, Mark, is that we might differ from other animals, maybe not in principle, but in degree. So even if that is true, right? So in the sense that let me put it this way, even if our rationality, which is often taken to be the hallmark of humanity, right? Even if rationality in human beings exists only to a larger degree than it exists in other animals, right? Let's assume that that's true. The fact that it does exist to a larger degree in us than them could make the moral difference in this respect. In other words, because it exists in us to a larger degree, what does that mean? That means that human beings are able to conceptualize moral concepts. They are able to conceptualize wrong from right, basically. They are able to deliberate for quite a while about what actions they should take, basically. So there is a sense in which we can hold human beings responsible for failures and for successes that we probably would not want to hold other animals, right? In that respect, at least that's my position. Now, somebody can argue that all this talk about rationality in human beings, even though it's much deeper, even it's much larger as a matter of degree than other animals, it's all just a facade, and that behind it, we are just products of our instincts. As a matter of fact, we have absolutely no agency whatsoever. And when I hear agency, to me, what springs to mind is the notion of having free will, that we are capable of going against our instincts in a certain way to do what we think ought to be done. This was, of course, the fulcrum of Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy. So I think that human beings do have rationality, and they do have it to a much larger degree than other animals do, and that makes us morally responsible in ways that other individuals of other species are not, basically. Even though we can meaningfully talk about certain animals, especially social animals, as having a certain kind of moral sense to some degree. So I'm with you on that. But I think with human beings, our sense of agency, our having agency is deeper, stronger, more conceptual than other animals. And that puts us in a much more unique moral position than they are. So yeah, basically. So, but one quick thing and speciesism to me is not so much a theory that describes the differences between human beings and animals and other animals, as much as it is a moral theory about whether we deserve a special better treatment as human beings than other animals. And there is a crucial difference here, which is that someone can argue that human beings do not deserve better moral treatment than other animals, because even though we might have rationality to a degree that other non-human animals don't have, we are all sentient creatures. And so just because of sentience, we all deserve more or less types of equal treatment, right? But that is perfectly compatible with also saying that nonetheless, human beings are morally responsible in ways that animals are not. So I think that you can claim that human beings are morally responsible in ways that other animals are not, without necessarily being a speciesist about it, if that makes sense.
I guess it's the negative judgment to our particular species without judging the other species. But as you said, like it can make the relevance depending on the degree of making the judgments. And I want to be careful here of what I'm about to say, because I am not a moral relativist.
Yes.
However, given the history of ethics, morality, and philosophy, this has not been a static thing. We're continuously evolving our what we think is right and wrong. So for me, it would be very difficult to be like, well, this is like humanity has failed under this ethical system when there's multiple ethical systems. There's multiple judgments about what's right and wrong. And I do believe there are things that are right and wrong. But again, it's just like, historically speaking, we're trying to figure this out. I have more, my attitude towards humanity is just, it's a more like, I feel saddened for humanity, and we're trying our best to figure it out in a chaotic universe.
Yeah, no, I agree. It would be an interesting exercise, actually, to see whether under, just building on your comment a little bit, it will be a nice exercise, an interesting philosophical exercise, to see whether under the various moral theories, because you're right, there are different moral theories, but they also have certain common grounds between them. So it would be interesting to see whether under the various moral theories, they can all reach the judgment that humanity has been a failure.
Right. Yeah.
Because if they all do reach the judgment for various reasons, that would tell us something. Maybe somebody should publish a paper on that. But that tells us something interesting about misanthropy, which is that regardless of your allegiance to the moral theory in question, that moral theory is going to probably yield a conclusion that under its own terms, humanity has been a failure. So for example, if you look at Immanuel Kant's moral theory, the injunction is that you have to treat humanity in people and in yourself always as an end at the same time as you treat them as a means. We can look around us and we can see how many people have failed in this injunction. They have failed to live up to it. If you look at utilitarianism, and utilitarianism is the theory that we ought to engage in those actions that maximize pleasure, or whatever it is that consequentialism takes to be the important unit of value, to as many people concerned, to all relevant parties, we have failed miserably in that. Just looking at our treatment of animals basically tells us how much we have. So in virtue ethics, how many people do we know are virtuous? Practically maybe 0.001 of the population, right? But of course we have to agree what the virtues are and also, but bracketing that question, whatever list of virtues you're going to come up with, unless by virtue you mean vice, which we don't mean by it, of course, we don't mean by that, you're going to come to the conclusion that most people have failed to be virtuous. So I think whatever moral theory espoused, regardless of how different they are, they're going to have that conclusion. But that's still work that needs to be done, I think.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. This is fascinating. I hate to move us on to a different thing, but just in the interest of time. Raja, you and I have briefly discussed through email that antinatalism has become a bit of a phenomenon within the Arab world, with some of the largest online antinatalist communities being entirely in Arabic. As somebody from Beirut, as somebody who is familiar with the Arabic-speaking world, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about why this might be.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I am not sure why that is, and I wonder whether it differs from one region in the Arab world to the other. So, for example, I was thinking about Lebanon specifically, because my understanding is that Lebanon has one of the larger anti-natalist communities in the Arab world, not larger than Egypt, perhaps, but it's for the size of the country, it seems quite large. So I was thinking about why that could be, and a few things came to mind, which is that number one, Lebanon, of course, has undergone since its independence, even before its independence from the French, right? Lebanon has had upheavals of civil strife. During the Ottoman Empire, there were at least two major times when Christians and Druze slaughtered each other, basically, one in 1840 and the other time in the other year was 1860. And then, of course, we had World War I and the French Mandate came along. And then in 1958, the president had to call on the Marines because there was, and then, of course, the official civil war started in 1975. It went on till 1990, and we're still feeling its effects, right? And so the Lebanese have witnessed a lot of traumatic, I don't like to use the word trauma too much because it's been diluted a lot, but the Lebanese have witnessed a lot of terrible upheavals in their country, basically. Of course, there are entire segments of the population that have lived in poverty for a long chunks of its life, basically. But the other thing that is interesting about Lebanon is that Lebanon has one of the highest literacy rates in the Arab world. The Lebanese population is a very educated population. And you find this in other Arab countries, of course, but Lebanon is renowned for its schooling system is excellent, basically. Almost every school in the country teaches in at least 2 languages, either Arabic and English or Arabic and French. Many schools teach in 3 languages, Arabic, English, and French. And so it could be that there's a confluence between, and of course, the other factor for Lebanon is that the Lebanese community, there are more Lebanese who live outside Lebanon than there are Lebanese who live inside the country. So there is a lot of exposure, which is not saying much for a country that's 4 million people, but still. So there is a lot of exposure by the Lebanese for all sorts of ideas. I don't want to call anti-natalism to be a specifically Western idea, but it certainly seems to be quite mostly accepted in the West. So the confluence of these 3 seems to make the Lebanese a little bit more amenable to the idea of anti-natalism. The case of Egypt, I don't know. I think the point that Laith made about the overpopulation and all this that makes people wonder about having so many children might be a good explanation for it. But one common thing I think that combines all these is basically the fact that almost all Arab countries have had to deal with a lot of terrible things, basically. And number 2, most of the Arab populations are highly educated. Basically, in that respect, the Arab world is, so that probably is always breeding ground for interesting ideas and novel ideas and so on and so forth. I have a good friend in Egypt. His name is Badr Mustafa. He's now head of an institution that undertakes to translate a lot of philosophical works from English and other languages to Arabic, basically. I think they translated my book on sex, love, and marriage into Arabic. He asked me for a list of books that he thinks are good to translate. I put Benatar's book on the list. I don't know whether he's going to get it. I don't know whether he will actually do it or not. I should actually email him. I haven't been in touch with him for a while, but I'll ask him about this. I'll let him know about this podcast too, so that he can be aware of it. But as Laith was saying in his interview, it is a touchy subject in the Arab world. I mean, there are certain topics in the Arab world that you wouldn't discuss. And it doesn't matter if you're a Muslim, you can also be a Christian. So for example, you go to Lebanon, right? And Lebanon is the country with the highest minority of Christians in it. Egypt, it's like the Copts there are maybe 2% of the population. Lebanon, the Christians come up to about 25% of the country. It has been, having Christians in the country has been a very good influence on us, I think, I have to say, and I apologize to my Muslim friends, but really, having Christians has been really good. But even when it comes to certain topics, the Christians and the Muslims are on almost total agreement, right? So bring up the question of homosexuality, and you will have the head Sunni sheikh in the country dumping on it, and you will have the patriarch of the Maronite Church also dumping on it. There is this social conservatism that both agree on. And I think that anti-natalism is definitely going to be one of those things. It's not going to distinguish between, the dislike of it is not going to fall along religious lines at all. It's going to fall along social conservative lines. It would be interesting, however, to find out, and you will probably know more about this than others, because one of the things that is interesting about the Arab world is that those Facebook platforms about anti-natalism have taken off, basically. People seem to have a lot of subscribers. So it would be interesting to know whether other platforms have been attempted in other countries, other parts of the world, and how well did they do? Because if they didn't do well, that will actually raise the question, why the Arab world specifically are those platforms being successful? But if they haven't been launched at all, or in any serious way in other countries, like maybe Eastern Europe, some parts of Africa, perhaps South America, where you'd expect to have a certain amount of social conservatism, it would be interesting to know whether they have been launched and they failed, and then you have a really interesting comparison with the Arab world, as opposed to no one even attempted to do that in those parts of the world, which wouldn't tell us anything interesting about the Arab world until we are able to make that comparison. Yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, so many fantastic thoughts, so much I want to touch on. So I would say that the boom on Facebook of these Arabic Facebook pages that got so much attention, it happened before booms in other places. So, like I would say maybe 2 years ago, that one that I linked you to had about 70,000 members. Now it's up to 100,000, I think, or so. So, but that was before this phenomenon happened where a man, our friend Raphael Samuel in India, he didn't even do it, but he threatened to sue his parents for giving him life. And this became a huge international story. It was all over press everywhere. And, now there's even before that, there was Child Free India. I work with them pretty consistently. So there's a huge boom in India. There's lots of anti-natalists in India. And now there's more groups springing up all over the world. There seems to be a lot of anti-natalism happening in Poland. But I would say, and I didn't really say, we did talk about it being a social movement. I would say within the last 3 years, that's really started to take form, where you have more people going out on the streets talking about it all over the world. And it's not just, it's moving away from social media, but it's sort of like, what you're talking about, the sort of the reaction to antinatalism within the Arab world, it's going to be very controversial, as you're saying, and maybe even dangerous. I think that that's absolutely true. And we haven't really seen a lot of that happen yet, but that people are sort of slowly crossing that fear barrier all over the world and are getting more vocal about it. And I'm excited, but I am also concerned about what that's going to look like for anti-natalists with all over the world, but perhaps even especially within the Arabic speaking world. Please go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think, there could also be different explanations for why different social movements of anti-natalism flourish in certain parts of the world. So it could be that the explanation that applies to the case of Egypt and the case of India, right? Both of which are heavily populated countries with a large amount of poverty, with quite deep poverty in them. Basically, that could explain why anti-natalism there goes, as opposed to the case of Poland, which might have a very different explanation. One other thing also that I would like to mention, which is a little bit, I don't know, it might be a little bit controversial, which is that movements such as this require time to see how long lasting they are, because some of them could be faddish, basically, if people can join them because they would like to come across as rebellious, right? As pissing off their parents, or as looking, rebellious or cool or whatever, etc. So it would be interesting to follow those movements across a number of years to see how. If you look at veganism, for instance, and I don't know a lot of the sociological facts about veganism, but veganism seems to be gaining steam as we go ahead. But one of the things that sustains veganism, I think, is the more and more availability of products that people can eat without having to consume animal products, right? With anti-natalism, we are talking about a movement that basically goes against a deep, deep instinct that is found in human beings, and that, if I had a dime for every time I met a person who, when they were young, said, I don't want to have children, right? I'm feminist, I'm so and so, so. And then once they hit a certain age, comes the husband, the wife, the kids, the dinners, so it's interesting to see how those movements fare across time, but also to see how the individuals themselves, to what extent their commitments waver and how much they don't. But I don't know any of that. I'm just throwing that out as a thing to look out for, basically.
No, absolutely. I mean, I've been in this for 11 years now. It's certainly grown tremendously. I mean, it was, when I first started, it was a pile of us on YouTube, and now it's, it's really huge by comparison. But you never know. I don't know. I'm also constantly on the lookout for clues as to is there going to be a point where it just drops off, are half the antinatalists going to have kids later on in life? You just never know. We shall see. All fascinating, but I definitely want to move on to talk about, the subject of teaching antinatalism as a subject. When and why did you start your course, Controversial Moral Issues? Pardon me.
Yeah, so I think the course that you sat in on, Amanda, wasn't controversial moral ideas. I think it was death and the meaning of life. That's the course. Because I wouldn't.
Apologies.
No worries. I wouldn't expect you to remember anyway. But I wouldn't have used the David Benatar book for the controversial moral ideas, because that course, controversial moral ideas, ranges over all sorts of topics. So, for example, I taught the class the spring semester when COVID hit, right? And we dealt with a lot of interesting social issues, like we did a segment on abortion, a segment on taxation, racial profiling, gun control, basically. So we did a lot of things. When I taught that class before, I did a segment on procreation. I used the little book, the short book by David Wasserman and David Benatar called Debating Procreation.
Yes.
Where Benatar has his argument, the asymmetry argument, the misanthropic argument, he has them all in there. And also David Wasserman responds to that. So I used that in a previous iteration of the controversial moral ideas. But the class you attended was Death and the Meaning of Life, basically. And I taught that in there because obviously, when we procreate, children are going to die eventually. They grow up and they die, as we all do. And also whether having children gives people a meaning to their lives, whether having children gives children a meaning to their lives. So clearly that topic belonged to that class also. But I also taught the topic because it's probably one of the most important topics to discuss. I mean, what is more important than making the decision, even though people take it lightly? I think a lot of people take it lightly, but they shouldn't. I mean, it's one of the most important topics to ask yourself: should I have children, and why? What is the reason why I'm having children, and so forth and so on. So I taught it in both classes because I think it's an important topic for the students to think about, right? Especially at this age, especially when they're soon going to be graduating college and building their lives. And so yeah, that's why I taught it. I think because it's an important. I don't usually teach topics in ethics that I think are just silly, or I just want to get the students excited about something like that. I try to choose topics by deciding, well, these would be good for them to think about as critical thinking skills, but also just as from the point of view of substance, it's important for them to wrangle with those questions.
So did you, for the death, was that like the philosophy of death? Like people like, did you talk about, Looper, Kagan, Fisher, Ben Bradley, like in that realm? Was that part of?
Yes, it was in that realm. So I don't think I think they read something by Looper. I don't think they didn't read anything. Fisher, you mean John Martin Fisher, right, Mark?
Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't read anything, but they read other people on death. So basically in that class, what we did was the part on death was the part on, is death bad for us and why? And obviously that whole section comes from the Lucretian argument from the ancients. So, some of the Stoics who tried to argue that some of the Epicureans, that death is not bad for us because when you die, you're no longer there and so forth. And that has spurned an entire debate and philosophy about the badness of death and the different theories as to why death is bad for us. Yeah.
Yeah, and Nagel's paper, Death, as well.
Yes, of course, they read Nagel's paper on death, obviously.
So so I guess we sort of have the same network with the philosophy of death. Have you presented or gone to the philosophy of death conferences?
No, I have not. I have not gone to the philosophy of death conferences. God help me, Mark. There are so many conferences going on.
I know.
So many areas in philosophy that I'm interested in, but I haven't. No, I haven't. I would. I really should, because I am moving more into misanthropy at this point. I'm going to write a paper on misanthropy and virtue. This is my next task after I finish this book on the philosophy of sex. I have a couple of other papers that I'm working on now that I would like to finish. There's a paper on sexual orientation that I'm finishing. There's another paper on, anyway, that's not what you asked me. So I want to finish those projects. So then I'm going to move into misanthropy, dead and centered. And of course, misanthropy has clear connections to questions about death. So I should probably be attending more conferences. It's just that I just don't have the time, basically, is my issue.
What was your students' reaction to the badness of death? Or are they more an Epicurean view? Because it depends on the social network. Whenever I'm talking to, say, effective altruists or atheists that tend to take the Epicurean view, but then when I talk to philosophy professors, like, no, deprivationism is the popular view, and I'm like, well, okay,
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm trying to remember how their reactions were. I think many of them. So here's the thing with students, especially undergraduate students, their reactions are often dependent on their level of understanding of the material, right? So the more they understand, the more they change their reactions. So initially, if I remember correctly, I think initially a lot of the students were Epicurean in the sense like, yeah, you die, basically. That's it. There is nothing. And so they were mostly concerned. They were mostly claiming that the badness of death might have to do with the process of dying, basically, not so much with the state of death itself. But then when they read, as you said, like deprivation accounts of death, that basically starts to strike them. Oh yeah, maybe death is bad because it does deprive people of all these years, basically. So they change their attitudes about it depending on as we move along in the class and as they read more and more.
How do you feel about the work of David Benatar in general, if I may ask? What originally drew you to working with his material in the classroom?
I like David's work a lot, and I think David Benatar is poised to be one of the most influential philosophers of the century, basically.
Wow.
Yeah, I
agree.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of famous philosophers, but I think he's going to be up there, basically. I like his work a lot. And what drew me to his work is basically, it's quite simple. I mean, there's not, at the time when I started teaching the class, I didn't know of many philosophers who had argued so much about anti-natalism in a clear way and who had given arguments that are actually compelling. I think David Benatar's asymmetry argument is a very compelling argument in many ways. Yeah, you can nitpick with it here and there. I'm sure some philosophers have done that. I think, what's her name? Anyway, you can nitpick with it, but it's a very interesting argument, and I think students, once they understand it, they are drawn to it in many ways. Yeah, sorry.
I feel like on the tip of your tongue, you're going to say someone.
Elizabeth Harman.
Elizabeth Harman. Yeah.
Yes, is the one. I was going to say Elizabeth Barnes, but I'm like, no, it's not Elizabeth Barnes. It's another Elizabeth. So I had to remember, and I knew her father is a famous philosopher, so it was Elizabeth Harman. Yeah.
Yeah, and Christina Overall has been
Christine Overall's criticism, I'm sorry to say, I hope she's not watching this. I don't think her criticisms are good at all against David Benatar. She misunderstands his position. And I'm just going by her chapter in her book, Why Have Children, basically.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a good chapter.
What's your opinion on Rivka Weinberg, if you've browsed her material?
I've seen some of her papers. I haven't read any. She has a book out also, right? Rivka Weinberg, I think, on the subject, yes. But I haven't read it, so I cannot comment on it.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Do you see antinatalism as a dangerous idea, like particularly within the classroom? Like, is there a risk of exposing younger people to it, especially given, art students, depression, and not just antinatalism, but subjects like the right to die and extinction?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. When I think about risk, I often think about arguments that old school people in my family used to make about homosexuality. Well, you don't want to talk about homosexuality, right? Because there is a risk that the children will grow up to be gay, right? And my reaction is that, well, that's not a risk really, because being gay is neither bad nor wrong, neither bad nor good. It's just, a sexual orientation. So I don't see what the risk is. And I had a similar reaction about the material to teaching on anti-natalism, which is, what is the risk exactly? I mean, the risk could be that the students will come to adopt it, but since I think this is the correct moral position to adopt, I don't find this to be a risk at all. I think it's actually a healthy thing to help them maneuver. However, the way you ask the question now touches more on the psychological effects of the students themselves if they were to learn it. Because we know that a lot of art students sometimes tend to have more than average in terms of some perhaps mental issues, in terms of depression, anxiety, and so on and so forth. And so there is a risk there to their mental well-being. I think the risk is there, and I'll tell you a little anecdote in a second. But of course that differs from one student to another. So I wouldn't want to stop teaching the material or discussing the material with the students on the somewhat high chance, admittedly, that they will feel that it will affect their mental health, you know. So what I did when I taught the class on death and life the second time, and what I did when I taught the controversial moral issues, in which I included the debating procreation stuff, what I did was I did say to the students, we will be discussing some topics in this class, and I will, it's like a trigger warning, honestly, but one that I think is perfectly justified in that case, where I said, you need to handle that material carefully, and so on and so forth. The most difficult part teaching that class wasn't so much on anti-natalism, it was the section on suicide. And that is the most difficult part. And I always think 3 times before, not twice, but thrice, about whether I should teach that material. David Benatar's essay on suicide is especially poignant because David doesn't mince his words about many things. And there is even a passage in which he says, sometimes it might actually be good counsel to tell someone that their life is not as good as it could be. So in other words, he has this passage where he basically says, you might want to advise someone to commit suicide, you know, and that's a really difficult passage for the student. So the heart, and that's what I worry about mental health issues, because I worry that if I have any students in the class who are in any way suicidal, and they read that essay and they get convinced by its arguments, that's what scares me, right? And of course, it's one thing to be an anti-natalist, where you prevent actualizing potential people, right? It's another thing to teach something that will actually make existing people's lives worse to the point where they commit suicide. And suicide is not an easy topic for obvious reasons, most of which has to do with the effect of the suicide on the people around the person, for all, you know, psychological and so on and so forth. So that's the part that really, and I remember one time I was teaching this class, and I had this student who took maybe 3 of my classes. And I was talking about suicide, and I was explaining the argument of how someone that, because here's the thing, they were, with the whole argument was about the quality of life, right? About someone who has a fatal sickness, maybe in the last few years, the sickness is going to completely cause them atrophy, mental atrophy, physical atrophy, however it is, and the rationality of that person having the right to die and wanting to die, basically, whether assisted or non-assisted, right? But then I was making the case to the class, and I think David has something in brief about it in his essay, where there could be cases of suicide, and I'm sure somebody has published a little bit more about this than I know of, but where there could be cases of suicide in which it is perfectly rational for someone to commit suicide, even if their life, by average standards, is going well. In other words, even if the person isn't having a serious physical illness, right? But is just tired of living, basically. They just reach a certain age, they're 60 years old, whatever, 70. I'm trying to make it not too old, but also not too young, right? And they're just tired of life. They've seen what they think they want to see. They've experienced, they've you know, they led a rich life, and they have reached a point where where waking up in the morning is not as exciting as it used to be in the past. They don't have any serious dependence on them, right? Their friends will understand, whatever, and they make the decision to commit suicide. And I was trying to present to the class this type of case and to discuss with them whether it is rational or not. But I think the way that I was presenting it, I don't know how it was, but there was one student in the class, when I looked at her, there were just tears streaming down her face. And I was like, oh shit, Raja, what did you do, basically, right? So then I had to switch gears, because I was worried about her. I was worried that this, you know, so then I had to switch gears and basically say, well, what do you think? Do you think this is a rational case of suicide? Because I caught myself that I was actually, in narrating the story, I was sort of trying to convince them of its rationality, right? And that's where I tried to pull back and basically get the class to discuss. They discussed it. She was okay. She was actually part of the discussion. She said, I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm crying. I'm fine, I'm okay. I touched base with her afterwards, she was fine. So it was a very difficult moment in the classroom, and the subject itself was very difficult. Sorry, I'm going on and on about suicide, and we're talking about antinatalism, but
No, they're very related.
Yeah, I actually wanted to, would you have any advice for someone that's trying to look into the philosophy of death and suicide? And so this has actually been my personal thing. Like I really enjoy antinatalism philosophy, procreative ethics. I love talking to philosophy professors on this. The one area, reading David Benatar's work, I'm fine with. It's, I don't know if you've come across Michael Cholby's work, but he was the last person for me to engage with, because he takes it, he goes, that's his specialty, right? And yeah, I was kind of worried, because it's one thing to have a chapter on it, but to like author the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on it.
He has
to
a short
write,
book also on it. He has a short book on suicide.
yeah, and he has a book on it, and so right now I'm okay with it because I do enjoy the philosophy of death area, but I do worry about how dark can this go, and what would it do to me psychologically, or talking about it, because there's a type of information hazard that can happen to, like, yeah, just people who may not I don't know, have the mental space to engage with the topic. And I was just wondering if you had any tips or advice for people who want to intellectually engage with it, but also, worry about going down a dark path.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty with the tips and advice about this is that people's reactions to this material differ widely depending on their psychology and depending on their inclinations. But one thing I always like to keep in mind, and that I've said a couple of times to my students, which is to remind them that one difference between the way the Greeks used to do ethics and the way we do ethics is that to the Greeks, ethical inquiry was to a large extent therapeutic. In other words, it was to a large extent to help them know how to cope with things, basically, right? And to become better people in general. So my main advice about discussing topics such as death and suicide and not procreating is that it basically is not just a theoretical question about what is right and what is wrong, what should be done, what should not be done, but it's also a way for us to help to think about death in the future and how to reach a sort of state of equanimity towards it, to use the famous words by some of the ancient Greek philosophers. But that can only work so much if you have a person who is suffering from certain kind of things. So that's a risk, I think, that is in many ways unavoidable, especially when you're teaching a class on the subject and you don't know the profile of your students, the psychological profile of your students, because you cannot control that. So the best way you can do is to basically try to advise them that what I do is I say this is a philosophy class. So, we're engaged in a theoretical inquiry here. But of course, it's going to have a psychological effect on you. So try to think of it in terms of ways that would help you think about death for the future, for example, and how you are going to face it when the time comes.
Yeah.
But it's tough. It's difficult.
Yeah. Though I do want to say, like, I think these topics have given me, I light up when I think about these tough topics, and I think it informs my total worldview, and I found it informative, and it's like having an existential crisis and slowly fitting in different pieces together and seeing a new picture. So
absolutely.
It's been mostly positive.
Yeah, absolutely. In my case, I like to distinguish between a psychological pessimist and a philosophical pessimist. I am a philosophical pessimist about all sorts of things, but I'm a happy person. I like being up in the morning. I enjoy my coffee. I like my vegan ice cream. I like all that stuff. So I don't have an issue. So there could be a lot of people who are they have a, to quote Kant, they have a sunny disposition, right? But at the same time, they don't shy away from looking, who's the author who said, you look eye in its bloodthirsty eye, basically. I think it was the Canadian author, what's her name? She wrote Brokeback Mountain. Anyway, her name escapes me. But she has this amazing phrase in the shipping news where she says, she's talking about the main character, and she said he looked at life in its shifty, beady eyes, basically, which is a beautiful expression. But at the same time, so you can have this theoretical bent where you face things, think about them, and enjoy thinking about them, even though they are dark. But you can also be psychologically more on the happy side, which I think is perfectly compatible, basically. But that's how it happens to me. I don't know how it is for others. Yeah.
Yeah.
That distinction between psychology and philosophy is very important, and I've often described myself as the happy-go-lucky pessimist. And it's just because if you're gonna live, you got to have some separation. So, no, sorry, Mark. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
No, that was all.
Okay. No, thank you for that. How would you characterize the general response to the subject of antinatalism from the students? And maybe, well, you talked a little bit about the response from your colleagues. You are very good at getting students to engage. You cannot sleep in a Raja Halwani classroom. I mean, you must speak and give your opinion, which I loved about your engagement with students. So what was the most common response to antinatalism that you witnessed during your lectures? And what, if any, was the pushback?
I don't recall. I think that the common response was acceptance. They liked it. They were like, this is an interesting theory. It's convincing. The students have a hard time arguing against Benatar's asymmetry argument, basically, right? There was no pushback. There was very little pushback. If there was, I don't remember much of it. There might have been some pushback when they read Wasserman in the other class, in the controversial ethical issues class. They read Wasserman, and they thought that his arguments about bringing children into the world for the sake of having a relationship with a future child, and the child having a relationship, I'm probably massacring his argument. I haven't read his work in a while, but they thought that there was some merit to that. But even the students who thought that there was some merit to that, they didn't necessarily think, that this guy has just philosophically buried David Benatar's argument. Even those students were quite welcoming of David Benatar's, and this is the nice thing about, if anything, Amanda, if I might complain a little bit, I find SAIC students, I wish they can often, every now and then, adopt a contrarian position to the one that they think is the most progressive, liberal is a bad word.
Yes.
They're always willing to jump on the progressive bandwagon. And I sometimes tell them, play the devil's advocate every now and then, because it helps sharpen your critical minds a little bit.
Yes.
To think about how but they're always happy to be progressive about every certain issue. So when that included anti-natalism, there was no issue with that, basically. They were perfectly on board with it. So.
Okay, interesting. No, I completely agree with you. If my memory serves me correct, the only pushback that I remember from sitting in on those classes were a certain optimism bias about what art brings to the table.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Where it was sort of like, but we can keep on creating, and we're not creating children, but we're creating these things out of ourselves. And that makes it always comes back to life worth living rather than the question of life starting or whether we have a right to do that.
Right.
And people getting caught in that.
Yes. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think you're right. I think you're reminding me now. I think here's the tricky thing. I don't know whether this is pushback or whether it is a form of pushback, but I think it's a form of pushback that rests on a confusion of Benatar's argument. Because the confusion is basically they keep thinking that Benatar, and maybe this is my fault as a teacher for not explaining it well, although I think I did explain it, but I think that confusion rests on the fact that they keep thinking that somehow David's argument is about good lives versus bad lives, right? So come in the art students on their shiny artistic horses, basically saying we're going to make lives better and better and better. Whereas they miss the point, which is the point is not to compare a good life versus a bad life, both of which are existing, but to compare a state of non-existence with a state of existence. I mean, this is the hinge and the fulcrum of Benatar's argument, of David's argument, basically. So I think that's where the thing is. And when you clarify that to the students, either they're like, oh, I see it. This is how the argument is. Okay. So I'm sure some of them don't like the idea. I'm sure some of them don't like it. They just don't know how to argue about it. So I didn't see any visible pushback from them in that respect, because it's very hard for them to argue against that position. Yeah. I hope that made sense.
It makes perfect sense. No, and I think that's exactly correct. Do you know of any other examples of antinatalism being taught at an undergraduate level, or have you heard about what it's like to teach it at any other level in any other circumstance?
At SAIC or in other colleges?
Other colleges, yeah.
I know that a lot of teachers teach anti-natalism in other colleges. Yeah, at SAIC, I don't know of anybody else who teaches it, maybe some in some other philosophy courses. A lot depends, interestingly enough, on where the teacher is teaching the material. So if it's in a school that, say, for example, in Alabama, not to name names, but if it's in a state that tends to be more conservative, where the population of the university or the college is mostly drawn from the local population, which is what tends to happen. A lot of the people, but that reflects the political views of the population. A lot of teachers get a lot of pushback from students in those kinds of universities. Other parts of the country, which is what you would expect, the students tend to be more liberal, more progressive about certain things. They're more welcoming of those views. But I don't know of any specific types of arguments that students have given as pushback towards this thing. This is just more of a general type of typology of where you're likely to encounter pushback values. Yeah.
You did mention in an email that you no longer teach the subject of antinatalism, and I was curious if you could tell me a little bit about why you made that decision.
Oh, the decision has nothing to do with the subject itself. The decision has to do with the fact that since the last 3 years, I have been elected into an administrative position, which is called the faculty liaison, that comes with complete full release, right? And so I'm not teaching as many classes as I used to. This is my last year of the position, so next fall I'm going to come back to teaching. I will probably teach in the fall philosophy of art, and I will also do controversial moral issues. I will teach antinatalism, if I teach the controversial moral issues. The last time I didn't teach controversial moral issues is because I used a new book edited by Bob Fisher. It's called Ethics, Left and Right, basically. And it's a book that contains 2 essays, one by a lefty philosophers, one by a conservative philosopher on the same subject, and they reply to each other. I thought the format of the book was really, really good, but it had nothing in it about antinatalism, and I didn't bring any outside material because, I asked the students to get the book. I don't want, I want them to use as much of the book as possible, so I didn't do it. But I think next fall, even though I like the book a lot, I might just use different topics, and I will definitely teach antinatalism again because it's really a crucial topic. So it had nothing to do with the subject. It just was completely happenstance as to why I didn't teach it.
Okay, excellent. Well, that's great news all around. You have a rather unique view, I think, into the general state of new controversial art being produced at the academic level. How much of the work that you see created at SAIC would you say is philosophically controversial or comes from a place of philosophical inspiration at all? Do you come across work at SAIC that deals with subjects like antinatalism or the right to die or anything related?
Yeah. I haven't seen recently many artworks that deal with issues about antinatalism and about the right to die or similar topics. And the work that I see that is philosophical in an indirect way. What do I mean by this? I mean, of course, all philosophy and art is going to be indirect because otherwise the art is going to be didactic and nobody wants to see that, right? But all the philosophy that I see is indirect in the sense that it tends to come from whatever issues are hot on campus, basically. And right now, for the last few years, what we've been witnessing is a plethora of artwork, mostly having to do with the intersection between the artist's own personal journey or life or incident or something that happened and their social identity. So the kind of ethnic background that the student has, or the racial background, or the gender background, and so on and so forth. So the philosophy is very indirect in the sense that the artwork might have something to say about issues of gender or issues of race or issues of ethnicity or issues of sexual orientation, but that's all mediated, I think, or mostly mediated by the artist's own personal history and identity and all that. So.
No, excellent. That's very much my own impression of the work that I see come out of SAIC. Okay, fascinating. All right, well, so much to talk about in terms of teaching antinatalism as a subject. I'm so happy that you will be revisiting it later on. In the interest of time, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about your specialty, the philosophy of sex and antinatalism's relation to it or non-relation to it. So, Raja, one of your most celebrated works is the philosophy of love, sex, and marriage, an introduction. Could you possibly give us a general summation on your views of love, sex, and marriage? I mean, how do your views on procreative ethics fit into that?
So, the interesting thing is about sex. So let's put love aside for a second. The interesting thing about sex is that, of course, sexual activity, heterosexual sexual activity, has been and still is the main way by which the species reproduces, right? So when you go into the ethics of sex, right, there's always been a school of thinking that we have inherited from the early Christians, right, and some Judaic philosophy and some Islamic philosophy about the importance about the morality of sex in connection to procreation, correct? So usually the idea is that you morally frown upon sexual activities that do not lead to procreation. And we've seen this with the various papist encyclicals and injunctions about contraception, about abortion. And so historically speaking, traditionally speaking, it has been that. Even Immanuel Kant, basically, who had a lot of interesting things to say about sexual desire and sexual activity, basically thought, well, if you're going to have sex, first of all, you should have it within marriage, although that had nothing to do with procreation. But then in other parts of his philosophy, he condemns masturbation, gay sex, and so forth, because it's not procreative, right? Even though Kant was the first philosopher to distance himself from our instincts. I mean, his whole philosophy was about, we have to think about what our inclinations tell us. Be that as it may, that's the thrust of the. Of course, a lot of contemporary liberal philosophers want to get away from that. They say, oh, let's throw off the shackles of traditionalism. The philosopher Alan Goldman, for example, in his essay Plain Sex, he's like, oh, so much of ethical philosophy has burdened sex with either that for sex to be morally permissible, it has to be procreative, or it has to be an expression of love, blah, blah. He's like, I don't want to have anything to do with this. I think, I'm going to call my essay Plain Sex because it's all about the pleasure of sex, and that's what's important. So even the most liberal philosophers don't see a connection between sexual desire and activity and anti-natalism, right? But here's the interesting thing. If you're an anti-natalist, you will be diametrically opposed to, say, Christian or religious views of the ethics of sex. How so? I mean, obviously you can work out the connection immediately, but you'll be diametrically opposed because whereas the traditionalists about sex, they will say sexual activity is permissible only if it leads to reproduction, or it is only if it is open to reproduction. And anti-natalist is going to say sexual activity is impermissible when it leads to reproduction. In other words, if the anti-natalists believe that reproduction is wrong because you put somebody at great risk of harm when you bring them into this world, then any sexual activity that leads to reproduction or that doesn't try to prevent reproduction is going to be more immoral or morally impermissible for that. Now, of course, there could be overriding factors, but everything else equal, the idea is going to be that it's going to be wrong. So an anti-natalist with respect to sexual ethics is going to put on its head the traditionalist view about sexual ethics. And so that's basically the connection, I think.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Just interestingly enough, there are, there's a large past as well as a growing current community of Christian anti-natalists, which I just find absolutely fascinating.
Of course,
we could spend all day talking about that, but I mean, what do you think of the idea of anti-natalism as an emergent form of sexual identity? Do you think that it is or isn't?
Sexual identity in what sense? That somebody would, so I can see it as a form of sex, but you can tell me more, but I could see it as a form of sexual identity in the sense that this is someone who says, I am going to have sex sheerly for the pleasure of it, never to procreate, right? I can see that as a form of sexual identity, but you might have something else in mind. Maybe I'm not catching up. So what would that mean?
I mean, it's a bit complex. I mean, I don't mean it in terms of sexual identity insofar as antinatalism is a part of the attraction element of sex, sure, but that it changes the social difficulty of sex. I mean, there are some antinatalists that believe that you should be celibate, There are other antinatalists who go, no, of course you don't have to do that. We have tools, you can have all the sex you want, just don't procreate. There's all kinds of difficulties in finding partners, I think, for a lot of antinatalists for a whole host of reasons, one being, have you had a vasectomy? Are you clear ahead of time before having a partner about what you want out of your life? Like, it requires more conversation than I think the vast majority of most sexual partnerships have. There's almost like, I'm not saying this literally, but there's almost a need for a kind of contract where it's like, if we get pregnant by accident, what happens? Like, it has to be laid out ahead of time.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So the reason why I answered earlier the way I did is not because, so that seems not so much to me a form of sexual identity, although it can be called sexual identity. It seems to be more of a kind of a relationship identity or marital identity. In other words, because I'm an antinatalist, I do not want to be with anybody else, for example, or because I'm an antinatalist, I will only be with people who are so and so, blah, blah, blah. I don't think as an antinatalist as such, there are going to be issues with sexual identity, in the sense that antinatalists, if they want to have sex and they are able to find partners, they can always have sex with somebody, casual sex, promiscuous sex, whatever, non-NSA sex, whatever you want to call it. And of course, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, Amanda, which is we've always had the tools to prevent procreation if we wanted to, from ancient times up to today, obviously, right? So it seems to be more of a marital or relationship identity, not so much as a sexual identity in that respect. So that's why the question, I think, a little bit tripped me up, basically. Yeah.
No, that makes perfect sense. I think you're probably 100% right that it's not quite sexual identity, but what was the way you phrased it? Forgive me.
Relationship identity.
Relationship identity. Yeah. I think you might be 100% right.
And that's where all the language of contracts comes in, because then you say, I will only be with someone with whom I am willing to agree beforehand on these steps, blah, 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 and so forth and so forth.
Yeah. Do you find that might be different? Like, do you think that there's any difference in that regard between antinatalism and child-free? Like, do you think that, like, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, do you think that it would be a sort of a different ball game between those two perspectives?
So I apologize for my ignorance, but it depends on what the child-free. So, for example, I don't want to pontificate on this, on something I don't really know. But what is the difference between child-free and antinatalist? One difference I can see is that you can have somebody who wants to be child-free for different reasons than antinatalism, because they don't have. The person need not have any sort of moral views about continuing the human species. The person might have views on that, but might also believe, well, you know what, my view is my view. I don't want to impose it on other people, So there could be various reasons for that. So I'm not sure what the difference is between wanting to be child-free, if those reasons are not individual to the person, right, and being an antinatalist.
Yeah, it's complicated, but I think it's basically what you just said. A child-free person doesn't necessarily, although I think there's a lot of crossover happening as time goes on. But in general, a child-free person doesn't have any philosophical convictions based on their choices. The extinction issue is completely not a part of the picture, whereas antinatalism, all of that is very, very relevant.
So then one crucial difference, that's interesting, because consider, for example, consider two parallel examples. They're not exactly parallel, but similar examples. You can have somebody who is a vegan, right, for moral reasons, not for health reasons, right? And such a vegan person might refuse to date somebody else who's also not vegan, or at least vegetarian, right? And somebody who's vegan for health reasons might not have that problem, because they're not going to have an issue with seeing a piece of steak in the fridge. As long as they don't eat it, what do they care? That's not their issue, right? But whereas a moral vegan will have conniptions about seeing a steak in the fridge. Certainly I would, right? I'm not, so I wouldn't go out with somebody who's at least not a vegetarian, right? Consider someone who's a polyamorous, for instance. You can have someone who's a happy-go-lucky polyamorous. Someone who's like, oh, sure, the more the merrier. You mean you're willing to be with me and 3 other people at the same time? Let's do it. Let's go for it. But you can have a polyamorist out of conviction, somebody who believes that monogamy is actually bad for us, because we are by nature a polyamorous species, for instance, right? And so that person, out of a matter of conviction, refuses to be with someone who is not at least willing and to be open to having other relationships with other people. And so I see the difference then between child-free and antinatalism as somewhat tracking this kind of difference. Whereas the child-free person, would just need to find someone who's willing to not have children with them. But the antinatalist is someone who wants to be with someone with similar values about the outlook on humanity and so forth and so forth. And
but also, they can, antinatalists can adopt kids, so it's not necessarily child-free.
That's true.
That's another important difference. Absolutely right. Child-free. I was understanding child-free as mean not through me, basically, but you definitely can adopt. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. What are your thoughts on the idea of antinatalism becoming a part of sexual education for younger people?
I mean, I think it absolutely should be. I mean, these are important arguments that we are considering. They touch on our future as a species on this planet, basically. And as long, and if they are presented in a way, I mean, I have this thing about trying not to present certain things to students as dogma, basically, as the right position, right? But, we present to our students, I don't know, the question of sex education is really fraught because so many things are presented to students in sex education as being the right thing to do. Like, for example, in the past, abstinence-only programs used to be taught as the correct thing. And of course, I'm opposed. I don't like this. I think depending on the age, students should be able to learn different perspectives on certain things. So absolutely, at the minimum, antinatalism should be presented to students in the sense, look, there are people out there who have some really good reasons for believing in the truth of antinatalism. And so they to them, sex should not be geared towards reproduction, basically. And so absolutely, that ought to be taught to students. I'm sure it will be met with a lot of resistance by parents, but that's a whole different issue.
Yes, no, absolutely. One of the most common arguments for antinatalism is that procreation violates consent. Some feel the consent argument to be the strongest argument for antinatalism, while others feel it to be the weakest. How do you feel about consent used in this manner, especially coming from your place of being a philosopher of sex? And what are your thoughts on the idea of procreation as a form of rape?
So this is tricky terrain, obviously, because the consent argument is a powerful argument, right? But it is, I don't know if it is the most powerful argument. And so, it's a powerful argument for all the obvious reasons. Number one, the most obvious reasons is that children don't consent to be in this world, basically. And they are not consenting to something that is probably the most important thing, which is their very existence, right? Of course, arguments contrary to this is basically the idea that, well, there is no entity that can be subject to consent. So perhaps arguments of consent are irrelevant to this. I don't think this is a very strong argument, but you can criticize it this way. Other criticisms come from the corner of hypothetical consent and retroactive consent. And these tend to be stronger arguments because notions of retroactive consent and hypothetical consent are common among ourselves. We give retroactive consent. Sometimes somebody does something and says, hey, Raja, I just did this. I hope that's okay with you. I didn't give initial consent. I can certainly say, absolutely, that's perfectly fine for me. So these are these counter arguments. One other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of children seem to give retroactive consent in the sense that they thank their parents for the life that they have been given. They're enjoying life, at celebrations. They say, I want to thank my mom and dad for bringing me into this world and experiencing its joys, blah, blah, blah. They tend to say it on festive occasions like weddings and whatnot. So there is that sense that the notion of retroactive consent that's going to be. So the consent argument is a very powerful argument, but does it have potential criticisms? Absolutely. So I know that's neither here nor there, but it's just like many moral arguments in philosophy, it's hard to be like definitive in one way, basically say that this is a knockdown argument.
What are your thoughts on the sexual ethics of antinatalism in the face of it being a pro-extinction movement? Because yes, we are opposed to birth, putting new people on the planet is bad, but some of us put more of an importance weight on that extinction part. And some of us even want to see sentient extinction. So what does that extreme look like to a sexual ethicist?
Why a sexual ethicist specifically? Why not? I mean, can that question not be asked to any kind of ethicist? An ethicist about why sexual ethicist? Is it because sex leads to reproduction, basically?
It can certainly apply to any kind of ethicist. As you are a sexual ethicist, I'm just very curious as to your specific thoughts on it.
Sure.
But also because I think, obviously when we're talking about all of sentience, that breaches the whole question of like when we're talking about animals can't voluntarily go extinct. If they're to go extinct as well, it probably requires some sort of intervention on our part, whether it's sterilization or even euthanasia or whatever. And so it's a very complicated issue, obviously.
Yeah. So so I don't think, as a philosopher of sex, from the point of view of philosophy of sex, there is anything specifically unique about this that would bring to this question. The one thing it could bring to the discussion is that sex, of course, is one of the pleasures that human beings, and varies among animals, but sex is one of the most unique and intense pleasures that human beings can experience. So if we come to an extinction, we are going to be deprived of that pleasure. There will be no longer entities that are sentient and that can experience this pleasure. But that argument is going to be part and parcel of the argument that with extinction, sentient human beings and other sentient creatures are not going to experience the joys of life. And life does have joys, basically, right? So that the only unique twist to it is that sexual pleasure is in many ways unique in itself and intense in itself. So that it will be a special kind of deprivation, not just, whether that's true or not, I'm not sure, but that would be that specific angle that philosophy of sex comes from. But I think with arguments, so let's set animals aside for a second. I think with arguments like this, obviously it's going to boil down to the question of how much pleasure and goodness is there in life versus badness and pain, which harkens back to the Benatar asymmetry argument, which is the idea that yes, when lives are in existence, it makes sense to make this comparison and to increase as much as possible the goodness. But as far as not bringing new entities into the world, that's not a problem because there's no one to be deprived, and that's fine, right? And so extinction seems horrible because to us, the word extinction, the concept, has very negative connotations. For centuries, we have prized ourselves as being a very valuable race, and so on and so forth. So to think of extinction and from a subjective point of view, extinction is a bad thing. I mean, when you think of the extinguishing of your own individual life, your heart is bound to skip a couple of beats because you're going to realize that you're no longer, your consciousness is going to go out of existence. You're not going to see that person anymore. You're not going to be able to enjoy a dinner with that person. You're not going to be able to pet that animal, and so forth and so forth. So there is this gravitas to it, right? But as is often with a lot of moral things, sometimes doing the morally right thing is very difficult, obviously, from the smaller force. So if we're clear-headed about anti-natalism and extinction is the inevitable consequence, we're just going to have to grit our teeth and do it. And as you probably know, Benatar has a very poignant passage in which he discusses that if this were to pass, the last generation is going to have one hell of a time dying because there will be no young people to take care of them. And usually it's the young people who hold up a lot of the society as we move on one thing together. The animal question is a really difficult, is it also a difficult question? There is a philosopher by the name of SAIC. I don't know if you have heard from him, but he's from Barcelona, I think. He has published a few papers in which he argues that it is absolutely our moral responsibility as human beings to intervene in nature so as to ease the suffering of animals. So, you have people who give the natural argument that we don't want to interfere in nature because even though when the zebra is mauled to death by lions, That's the natural thing to do. Of course, as philosophers, we know that the natural is not always the same thing as the good, right? You cannot infer one from the other. And so there are philosophers who advocate for the interference in nature. And as anybody who has watched an animal show knows, even not just animals in the wild, but even with our pets, the only animals probably in this world that have a decent life are pets, and only a select few if they happen to have owners who are decent human beings. Because as we know, a lot of people who get pets treat them badly, abandon them, and so on and so forth. And then when you go to the wild, animals' lives there are just, what's the saying? It's red in tooth and claw, basically. Is that right? So if we are concerned with minimizing suffering for animals, which anybody should be, I don't see a principled argument against that, against such interference, to be honest. Much as I'm romantically inclined to leave nature as pristine as it is, intellectually speaking, I don't think there is a principled argument against intervention. And as much as animals bring beauty and joy to the world, they also suffer a lot. Most of them die young, die brutally, So if we're really concerned with suffering, bringing them to extinction might also not be a bad idea. I don't know why it's sad for me to say it, but I think it's probably the right. I mean, part of the sadness, I think, is that whereas we are in control of our own destiny, we can make the voluntary decision not to have children, basically. And maybe even as a collectively, as a species, we can make this decision. This goes back to Mark's point of how much agency we have versus animals. Animals don't have that agency to make that decision. We're not going to have a conference of lions who say, we're going to stop eating zebras anytime soon, right? So any such decision, we're going to have to make it on their behalf. And there's always a certain amount of pain that comes with that, basically. So.
Pain and sadness. No, it makes me very sad too, even though interventionalism for the animals is my position. But thank you so much for your thoughts on that. Raja, there's so much else that I would love to talk to you about. It really has been incredibly fascinating. But I think this does come to a close of our interview today. But where can people find you on the internet? How can people support your work? Is there anything that you're working on right now that you'd like to talk a little bit about before we end?
People can find me by emailing me. I can send them any of my work if they're interested. My email is rhalwa@SAIC. They can find it online at SAIC, rhalwa@saic.edu. Every now and then I blog on I have it's called Raja's sometimes philosophical musings and confusings. I haven't blogged for a while, but they can go there also. But otherwise, I'm easily reachable by email, so they can find me online and email me.
No, I just want to say thank you for your time, and maybe a small plug that the 8th edition of your book is coming out. So people should look out for that too.
8th edition of the Philosophy of Sex is coming out, so yeah, please be on the lookout for that. It was nice to meet you, Mark, very much. It was nice, Amanda. It was nice to see you again.
And lovely to see you again, Raja.
Thank you for this opportunity. This was really nice. So thank you very much.
Absolutely, Raja. I have so much respect for you. This was just a wonderful thing to get to communicate with you again. Just thank you for all you do. And thank you so much for being our guest today on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Please follow Raja Halwani on his blog and find his book, Philosophy of Love, Sex, and Marriage, an Introduction on Amazon. Links below. Thank you for listening to the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. This has been Amanda Oldphan Sukenick and Mark J. Maharaj. You can find us on the YouTube channels Forever Wolf Films and Question Mark, respectively. Keep up with my daily antinatalist news updates at Antinatal News on Twitter. Please follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Buzzsprout, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Amazon.com, RSS feed, and so many other platforms. If you enjoyed the Exploring Antinatalism podcast, please share it around. We'd also love it if you happen to write a review for us. Email us at exploringantinatalism@gmail.com. Our website, www.exploringantinatalism.com, was designed by the incredible Visions Noirs. Please follow him at www.bionoir.com and make sure to also check out his Instagram. Logo art by the amazing Life Sucks. Please subscribe to him on YouTube, and if you would perhaps like to purchase one of the new Exploring Antinatalism t-shirts by Life Sucks, check out his Etsy at www.etsy.com/shop/LifeSucksPublishing. Our theme music was donated by the amazing I Doubt It. Please subscribe to him on YouTube. Thank you again for listening. All the best, and bye for now.